And today is Sharon Delgado, and we are so glad she's here. Her subject is divestment from fossil fuels as a climate change strategy. I want you to get to know Sharon. She is the convener of Fossil Free UMC, United Methodist Church, which advocates for the United Methodist Church to divest from fossil fuels. She also serves as the coordinating on the coordinating committee of the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement. Sharon, I want to say a word about Sharon. She was also on the writing team for the section of the revised social principles for the United Methodist Church. And she and others on the team took a fresh, very, very new approach to the section on creation care called Community with God's Creation. And it is a beautiful work that they did, and they really helped us move into a new era vis-a-vis climate change and care of the earth. Sharon has been advocating for peace, justice, and the healing of creation for over 40 years. She's a speaker, teacher, activist, and nonviolent direct action practitioner. She has a degrees in peace, war studies, theology, and environmental ethics. And she has continued to learn throughout her life through her activism, which is integrated with her practice of contemplative prayer. Sharon pastored churches for many, many years and also served on the staff at the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz during the early years of the War on Terror. She served as executive director of Earth Justice Ministries for many years until she retired in 2019, and she still serves on the board. Sharon lives in rural Northern California with her husband, poet Juardianix Delgado. She values sitting on her deck in the beauty of creation, walking in the woods, having time and space to write, and enjoying her grandchildren. She loves to dance. You can follow Sharon's blog and just go to sharondelgado.org. Sharon is author of Shaking the Gates of Hell, good title, Love in a Time of Climate Change, and more recently, 2022. Sorry, I'll tune off in a moment, but there's action in the hallway. That happens sometimes on Tuesday mornings. I'm very sorry. The Cross in the Midst of Creation came out in 2022, and she has an updated second edition of Love in a Time of Climate Change, which will be released next spring. The inside cover of the first edition of that book includes an endorsement by John Cobb, and I want to read a part of that endorsement. Sharon Delgado makes it clear that we, especially we who stand in the Wesleyan tradition, cannot choose between being scriptural in the fullest sense and activity to save as much as possible from destruction through climate change. There is no tension between biblical preaching and preaching on the overwhelming, life-determining issues surrounding climate change. Let's stop hemming and hawing and work with God to save God's creation. Sharon, wonderful words about a wonderful book. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we're in your hands.
I'm really glad to be here, everybody, to see you, to be ready to share some of my journey with you, some of my work, my perspective, my motivation, and some of what we're doing as Fossil Free UMC. I thank the Cobb and Friends for inviting me and giving me a place in this forum. I really appreciate it. I look forward to a challenging conversation with all of you afterwards. And I thank John Cobb for all the profound influences that he has had on me and on others, so many others, in such a good way. Thank you, John Cobb. I was first introduced to process theology back in the late 1980s when I was a candidate for ordained ministry. We went on a retreat, some of the candidates, district candidates, I believe, at Zephyr Cove in Lake Tahoe. And the presenter was John Cobb. So I got a good dose right then. And I had already been familiar with Thomas Berry and his work on the earth as primary revelation, the emerging new story of the universe, the work he did with Brian Swim, and the great work, which is a wonderful way to look at the work that we are doing in using our spirituality and our theology to go forward in taking work, doing work in support of peace, justice, the healing of creation. So it was a natural evolution in my thought kind of process style, that experience at that retreat. In seminary at PSR, I searched out and found the creation theology of John Wesley and looked into it pretty deeply, and it has influenced me as well. And that's part of what I write about in Love at a Time of Climate Change. His theology has a lot that's consistent with process thought, as many people have said before. Specifically in his older years, in his writings, even intermixed with his writings on grace, prevenient grace as not just limited to human beings, but as extended to all beings, to all creatures. The idea of what he calls omnipresence, God's presence in and through all creation, and even the soul of the universe, God as the soul of the universe. So these were and have been my ways of thinking. In many ways, they've shaped my ways of thinking. In 1992, I was part of the United Methodist delegation to Rio de Janeiro during the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, the first big environmental conference where several agreements were signed, including the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the first climate agreement ever. And it was actually a treaty signed there by George H.W. Bush and then later ratified in the Senate. I'm going to share my screen here with you and talk about fossil-free UMC and what we're doing with divestment. I'm going to have to get us set up with the, that isn't it, sorry. We're going to have to I'm going to set it up with, let's see, am I sharing right now? Are you all seeing it? No. All right. Here we go. This is what I meant to share. And I'm going to set it up from the beginning. There, fossil-free UMC. Our goals with fossil-free UMC are, one of the primary goals is to work with others in movements around the world to phase out fossil fuels in response to climate change, as the science says we must do. And we're starting with the United Methodist Church. We're wanting to get the church to divest from fossil fuels at every level and all levels of the life of the church. We were the first, the United Methodist Church was the first denomination to pass a resolution at the 1980 General Conference, way back when, calling on the church and the nations to transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy and conservation. So we were the first to call for that. But here we are, all these years later, and the United Methodist Church in our pension fund alone in Wesleyan has over $1 billion invested in fossil fuels, the big companies. Many of them are the big companies. So it's past our time for us to divest from fossil fuels. And we want, the other holdings are in our annual conferences and in our agencies and in our churches. We want this to be an investment screen against fossil fuels and written out officially as official policy of the United Methodist Church. So divestment from fossil fuels as climate change strategy is what I'm speaking about today, but it's actually a climate justice strategy because it's part of the strategy of the global movement for climate justice, which we will be talking about later. And fossil fuel divestment is a strategy to identify, face, and respond to the causes of climate change, not just to climate change itself, but to the causes of climate change. Because it is an existential threat and it is a primary moral and spiritual issue of our time. It's wrong to profit from wrecking the planet. That's really the basic slogan of the divestment movement. It's a moral statement, a statement of conscience, a statement of conscience saying that we need to break our ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. It's also a way to live into the teachings of Jesus in this way, this one aspect, by taking seriously his teachings on wealth and on how to treat other people. For instance, you can't serve God and money. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have others do. So it is a statement of conscience. And that's one of the first things, as well as a way to start phasing out fossil fuels by phasing them out of our own investments. So Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton are fresh in our minds. And I am involved in learning about it and finding out personal impacts because my sister lives in Asheville. So this is Asheville. I've been there many times. It was so severely damaged. My sister and her family, they have intermittent power now. They don't have running water and won't for perhaps weeks or longer because so much of the water system was damaged. My sister assures me there are a lot of rescue and help on the ground, passing things out, helping people, giving people shelter, and they're helping with the rescue efforts. But it's going to take years for this community to recover. There's my sister on the left, my sister Kathy and her husband Robert, and they're ironically on a vacation at the beach. That was several months ago. But Asheville is 500 miles inland. And that people thought, and I don't think they ever really said that, but a lot of people thought it was like a climate haven where the real bad impacts wouldn't hit very soon. But obviously none of us are safe. Here where I am in Northern California, wooded region, it's fires, of course, that keep people on edge. And I live about an hour and a half away from the town that burned to the ground, ironically named Paradise. So our terrain is somewhat like that. By the way, my sister, just out of interest, is the head of the Democratic Party in Buncombe County, and that is the stronghold, the Democratic stronghold of North Carolina, which is a swing state. So she's just was interviewed for This American Life, so it might come on one of these days. It sounded like it was a pretty interesting and fun, vital interview. This is from Hurricane Milton. They're really having to mop up for this. Milton, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was very bad. And one of the tragedies of climate change is that the people who are most vulnerable are the ones who are hardest hit. And this is in developed nations, but also globally. In developed nations, it's often people, well, children always. Children are so at risk. And there's someone on this call right now who's focused on children with the World Council of Churches, which they have a focus on the impacts on children and even calling it at some points homicide, the way that it's damaging children, killing children, harming children, and linking that to climate finance, which is what we're talking about today. So children, then communities of color and communities that are low wealth. These are the people that are hit hardest and often have the hardest time recovering from a climate disaster. And globally, it's the countries that have contributed the least emissions that have the worst impacts, such as the Philippines, island nations, drought-stricken nations, and that tend to be a lot of drought. Some areas in Central America, that continent of Africa, and so on. That's one of the tragedies of climate change, and that's why we call for climate justice, one of the reasons, besides the fact that it's an existential threat. Okay, what does the science say about climate change? Well, okay, I don't know if you can see that chart over on the, I have kind of being, there we go. I'm going to move this there so that you can see the line going up from 1890 all the way up to 2020. A lot of them just go to 2000, but this goes past 2020. And so at this stage now, this is from NASA, and we are at 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of warming. We have, in other words, the Earth has gotten 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And here we are it's actually 2.11 degrees Fahrenheit. And you know how you feel when you have a fever of 2 degrees or more. The Earth has a fever. And this line that's going up is continuing to go up. It's not turning around. It's not going the direction down. It's continuing to go up. Last year was the hottest year ever recorded. The past 20 hottest years were the hottest, but last year was the hottest ever recorded. And this year looks to be, so far, to surpass it. This year, it will probably surpass it based on what we've seen so far. So science tells us that we need to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to prevent cascading climate impacts. So we're already at 1.17 degrees Celsius. We need to not go up. We need to start leveling off at the very least. But emissions and global temperatures have been rising year after year. And at the rate we're going, we are on track, even with the Paris Agreement, to reach 3 or 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That's by 2100. And then what happens? It keeps going up. And science says that we have to act in this decade and limiting emissions to and warming to limiting warming by limiting emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius is going to require immediate and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And you can see the charts there. Implemented policies are part of the orange range, and then the limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees. It's got to start going down if we're going to limit. We need to phase out fossil fuels, is what this is saying. And divestment from fossil fuels is a step in that direction. So that's a little bit about climate change. One thing that people don't realize, it's really kind of hard to think about, it's people don't realize how fast the climate's changing. It seems like a slow process. But 85% of industrial emissions have been released into the atmosphere since 1948. And I know how long that is, 75 years, because I was born in 1948. So 85% of greenhouse gas emissions have been released in one lifetime, mine. Not only that, 30% of all emissions have 50% of all emissions have been released in the last 30 years. In other words, greenhouse gas emissions have doubled since the first climate agreement, more than doubled, since the first climate agreement was signed in 1992, doubled. Humanity has known the consequences. We've been negotiating international agreements on climate year after year. Greenhouse gases and global temperatures keep rising year after year. What's wrong with this picture? Well, we talked about looking at the causes. To answer this question, we need to look at the underlying systemic causes of the climate crisis, which is really a crisis of global civilization. We are already in ecological overshoot, and we see cracks in the foundation and in the whole structure of global civilization. We're already in ecological overshoot. It is unsustainable, and it really can't last. Empires come and go, and yes, it can't last. And so fossil fuel divestment isn't just a way to phase out fossil fuels in our small way through our investment. It's not just a way to take a moral stand by aligning our investment with our values. It is both of those things, but it's also a strategy to expose the primary perpetrators of the climate crisis. In Walter Wink's terms, in his work on the powers, looking at the cause means unmasking and naming the institutional powers that are causing or exacerbating the climate crisis. Well, it's easy to make the case against fossil fuel corporations, which drive climate change. And it's easy to talk about why to divest from fossil fuels. You can go to the fossilfreeumc.net website, read our talking points and calls to action. So here are a few reasons. So the industry, the fossil fuel industry, has known since the 1970s that their products would cause harm, would cause the planet to rise, and they have whole studies that they've written, internal memos that shows that they know this. So that's part of one of the campaigns, is that they knew, and instead of turning to renewables and changing their business plan, they instead doubled down on climate change. I mean, on the products that produce climate change, coal, oil, and gas. And instead, they created a machine, really, of doubt to convince people that it wasn't an issue, or it wasn't that bad, or it was caused by individual choices, not because they were promoting using and greenwashing and extracting and burning these fossil fuels. So they even followed the tobacco industry's handbook. Doubt is our product, says the internal memo of the tobacco company, tobacco industry. Reposition global warming as theory rather than fact, internal fossil fuel industry memo. And some of it's catching up with them now, because there are a lot of climate lawsuits that are taking place. They're being sued for climate damages. They're being sued for misleading advertising. They're being sued for to get them to reduce emissions. So there's lots of action around the criminality of their actions these days. And actually right now, California just announced they are suing ExxonMobil for lying about plastics and the way they're being recycled. I think 7% are able to be recycled, but that's what their I'll say propaganda, it popped into my mind. That's what they say. Okay, so that's so divestment, it focuses attention on these corporate bad actors. It focuses attention on them, and because by divesting, we remove our moral endorsement. As long as we're sitting at the table and we're engaging with them and taking their money, then it's a kind of an implicit endorsement. But by divesting, we remove that, and we remove our funds. It's a way to shake the dust off our feet, and not just because we want clean feet or not to be complicit, but as a testimony against them. Shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. And so it's a way to remove our endorsement, and it's a way to refuse to pretend that engaging with fossil fuel companies will convince them to change their business plan. Because their plan is to continue building durable infrastructure, not phasing out, building durable infrastructure that will lock in fossil fuel use for decades. And their business plan is to burn all their reserves, no matter at what risk to the planet. So that's fossil fuel companies. That's kind of easy. That's the easy one to see. But fossil fuel companies didn't give all this power to themselves. It's not just fossil fuel companies. It's the underlying system of advanced free market capital enforced by economic, geopolitical, and military power. It is human beings have engineered a global system designed to multiply wealth. And in my book, Shaking the Gates of Hell, which is an overview of the global economy from a theological perspective using the theology of the powers, it is working perfectly according to how it's designed. This is from we used to, in a particular church renewal group, there was a saying, the system is designed for the results it's getting. And so that's true. That's how I say it. The system is designed for the results it's getting. It is multiplying wealth. It's paying off handsomely for those relatively few, very wealthy people for whom it's designed. And the system is based on colonization, dominated by corporations, propelled by money, powered by fossil fuels, enforced by military power, and legitimized, sadly, by secular and religious ideologies. There's something wrong with this current system. There are many things, and I just want to give you a few concrete examples about what's wrong. For one thing, this system depends on unlimited economic growth, and that's in conflict with the flourishing of life on Earth. John Cobb and Herman Daly wrote a book a long time ago. It's been updated. It's called For the Common Good, and it talks about this, and it proposes steady state economics and other ways of measuring people's and everyone's well-being other than by GDP, gross domestic product. Another problem, corporations and very wealthy people, dark money interests, so that we don't even know who it is, who's divesting or who's funding these advertisements and political pressure. Money counts as speech. So what I'm saying is that corporations and big money interests can drown out the voices of the rest of us. And for fossil fuel companies, that means electing candidates of their choice to keep their business model going. It means lobbying, commercials, and lobbying really governments around the world to prevent strong climate action. Another problem. At international climate conferences, there are usually more delegates in the related to fossil fuels than there are people in national delegations. No wonder at the last COP was the first one where we even got the words fossil fuels into the document, even though it was a watered down way of talking about fossil fuels. Another, according to the IMF, government subsidized fossil fuels at the rate of $13 million per minute. Let's compare with renewables. Here's renewable energy subsidies, global. Here are fossil fuel subsidies, 36 times more than our subsidies for renewables. And yet, renewables are often cheaper at this point. They're becoming cheaper anyway. The World Bank says while 4-degree warmer world must be avoided, especially for the world's poor. But they continue funding massive, intensive fossil fuel projects to meet their lending targets. And the US military is the largest fossil fuel user and greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And war is profitable for fossil fuel companies. Aren't the wars going on today that are just seeming out of control and so horrific and horrendous and bringing us nightmares? Isn't that a prime example of the problem of this global system? It's a problem of the global system. The global system that underlies the current climate crisis and so many other ills needs to change. And I have to say, a breakthrough in climate action is not likely if we are limited to thinking inside the box of our current system. Here and now, as we're talking, we're looking at it from inside the box. A true resolution to this seems impossible because we are at a catch-22 moment, a fork in the road, an end of an age, And it's got to be the end of the fossil fuel party. We don't know how it's all going to turn out. In an essay called God of Nature and Grace, Michael Lodall, process theologian, celebrates the prevenient grace of God's presence throughout creation. He says grace that's persuasive rather than coercive. But he says, if indeed divine grace is persuasive, then the underside is that we may yet enact our own apocalypse. The stakes are high, but we are not stuck. There are actions we can take. We unmask and we name the powers, not just out of our own interest, not so we can give presentations, not so we can write books. We unmask and name the powers in order to engage the powers. And that's rarely something we can do alone. But as Bill McKibben says, if we can build a movement, then we have a chance. Changing the system requires building a global movement strong enough to pressure those at the apex of political and economic power. That's what we need to be about. It worked. Fortunately, the movement for climate justice is strong and it's growing, and you don't always read about it in the news. But it is strong and it is growing, and divestment is one of its strategies. This vital and growing movement is led by people, primarily led by people who are living and working on the front lines of climate change and their allies. By divesting from fossil fuels, we become their allies. We become allies in that movement. We join them in demanding justice for those experiencing the early impacts of climate change. We demand justice for people who are experiencing their lands being treated as sacrifice zones, their neighborhoods from being polluted by extraction and processing and pipelines, and just the mess that it causes, and the health impacts, and the damage that's left behind. And we call for justice for these folks, and we call for justice for the young people, for the children who are experiencing the climate crisis, and for the young people who are demanding a livable future, a future that they can hope in, a future that is livable for themselves and for future generations and for the other species with whom we share this planet. And we become allies with others in other movements who are working together to change and challenge and change the system that is causing climate change and so many other harms. Divestment is a way to do that, because we are joining in the efforts of the climate justice movement, and we're facing and understanding what's causing the climate crisis and taking action from there. And the slogan of this global movement for climate justice is system change, not climate change. So you'll see that at lots of rallies. There is a paradigm shift taking place today. And this paradigm shift is very much aligned with what you are talking about here. It's aligned with process theology and with the conversations you have week by week. This paradigm shift is a shift that's of what's revealed through science about the universe. It's a shift in cosmology. It's a shift in human consciousness, a shift in worldview. It's a realization that everything is interconnected and interdependent. The only problem is, even though this shift is taking place, and you've talked about this before, I'm sure, our dominant institutions have not caught up with this shift. Martin Core from the Third World Network talks about these conflicting paradigms. He says the first is the top-down system of corporate globalization backed by violence. The second paradigm is an emerging alternative system based on indigenous wisdom, focused on community, people-friendly, earth-centered, non-hierarchical, and non-violent. He says, because we live within this dominant system, we could say domination system with Walter Wink, or the normalcy of civilization with Marcus Borg, or just the real world as people talk about it. But because we live within the dominant system, we need to work to make it fairer, more just, less destructive. We need to vote. We need to advocate. We need to do the things that make it less destructive and more just. But we also, he says, need to nurture seeds of hope to bring alive the second paradigm and to infuse it into the first paradigm as a kind of transition. So we function within today's dominant system, but we don't have to give it our ultimate loyalty. And if we are privileged and have enough money to put in our banks or in investments, that money is multiplied many times over for use in the real world, for good or for ill. In fact, our investments may well be the largest part of our carbon footprint, unless we make a conscious choice to divest from fossil fuels. Divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in goods and services that foster a just transition to a clean energy future is a way to plant seeds of hope to bring alive the new emerging paradigm, which more reflects the world as we want it to be, and in my view, more reflects the world as God wants it to be, or that power that brought all life into being, brought the universe into being. So in our divestment work, we may do a variety of different things to work on changing the system change, not climate change. We may need to work with other people, and fossil-free doing that is working with other groups on the issue of stop the climate pipeline to climate destruction. The money pipeline, sorry, stop the money pipeline to climate destruction. That might mean changing banks. These are the big banks. These are the top contributors to fossil fuels, but it's hundreds of billions of dollars that go in annually, and they're multiplied many times over that money. If the financing really stopped, fossil fuels would stop. This is an action that we did, a bank action that we did locally here in little Nevada County, Northern California. And this is a clergy and lady from some churches. That this is our little contingent. It was a much larger demonstration, but this was our little third act faith contingent, because it was a action that we did in coordination with Third Act, Bill McKibben's group for people in the third act of their life. But this was Third Act faith, picture of us there. Banks cut it out or will cut it up, no more funding oil and so on. Banking on love. This is a picture of Judith Stone, who might even be here, I'm not sure, but my good friend. And This is us with our credit cards, mine from Chase, hers from Wells Fargo, that we cut up publicly that day, as did several other people. That was part of our banking on the future action. And this is just another sign that I like. It says money talks, mine says goodbye to these banks from the same action. Divestment from fossil fuels is appealing. I mean, it's appealing for, moral reasons and practical reasons and participation, but it's also appealing because fossil fuel return on fossil fuel investments are generally no higher than returns on low carbon funds. And in fact, that's even true in Westpac. They have 5 years of experience of low carbon funds that we can move our money into. But as fossil and climate change advances, it's going to be ever riskier to be investing in fossil fuels. It's a risky investment. I'm happy to say that there are institutions, 1,600 institutions plus around the world, with a total of over $40 trillion combined assets that are divested or are moving toward, they're divesting, they're in process of divesting, or they are completely divested from fossil fuels. And that includes 35% of these are faith-based organizations. Okay, and here was a big announcement. World Council of Churches, and so many other faith organizations. And because we're a so-called mainline denomination, I want to say that these include the UCC Church, United Church of Christ, the Episcopal Church, the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Reformed Church, Church of England, and the Methodist Church of Great Britain, and many more. And I hope the United Methodist Church will be next. Churches that and organizations that serve the common good should not fund corporations that perpetuate the climate crisis, because it's wrong to profit from wrecking the planet. So, fossil fuel divestment in closing. Well, closing this section, because I want to say a little bit more. Fossil fuel divestment is a strategy to align our investment with our values and take a step towards phasing out fossil fuels. It's a way to shake the coal dust and wipe the tar sands and the frack gas off our feet as a testimony against the fossil fuel industry. And it's a way to unmask, name, and engage the institutional powers that cause and perpetuate and underlie the climate crisis and that constrain effective action. Because it is wrong to profit from wrecking the planet. Now, if I have a little bit more time, I don't know if I do, maybe I don't. What do you say, Ron or Mary Elizabeth?
Sure, Sharon, sail on.
I have about 5 more minutes, and I just want to talk
That's
a little bit about my my motivation. I've been doing this a long time, but about 5 years ago, I went back to my home town, Oroville, California, to say goodbye to my mother, who had passed away about a year before. And I took a tiny little bit of her ashes just for a final goodbye. I went to the river in Oroville, California, my hometown. I sat down on the bank of the Feather River about 4 blocks from where I grew up. And I sat in the shade, saw the sun sparkling on the water, felt a cool breeze, and watched the salmon jumping. I didn't know that would be happening. That was the season. And it reminded me so much of my childhood. And I sat there thinking about my mother's life and how it was hard. She had a hard life, and she raised us 3 kids there in Oroville as a divorced mom in the 50s and 60s. I thought of my grandmother who also lived there, and of then my dad and other ancestors, other grandparents and other ancestors. And then I started just thinking about my children and the generations to come after. And I just thought about, wow, people work so hard to keep this cycle of life going. And as I watched the salmon, I thought, wow, the salmon are doing the same thing. They are fighting their way upstream, ending up battered and bloodied to get to upstream to spawn. In this case, it's the fish ladder. And all the animals are. And I thought about the process of evolution and how plants and animals all are moving in this direction here on Earth toward life, have been leading us to this time of fruition of life on planet Earth. And I sprinkled my mom's ashes, just a few little ashes, and I picked up a rock that fit perfectly in my hands. And I thought it felt so solid after the ashes. And then I thought about the space between the atoms of the rock, not so solid, and how it reflects the spaces between the stars. And I wondered if that rock had been there all along, or if it had just come down that day or in the last storm. And I started thinking about geological time, that 15 billion year process of the evolution of the universe. And through it all, there's been a power at work. Some call it God, or love, or divine grace, or the spirit of life, or simply the force behind evolution, nudging, drawing, beckoning, calling, sometimes driving creation through the evolutionary process. And this power has brought us on this planet to this point of flourishing of life on planet Earth. Amazing, miraculous, marvelous universe and planet. The past generations have been sure that this cycle of life is going to continue, no matter what else happens. But younger generations today aren't sure anymore because of climate change and related problems. Climate change is having evolutionary impacts. Think about the 6th great extinction that's happening now. And even in geological time, there are impacts because the things that are happening today usually take geological time to happen. The melting of the ice caps, the rising of the seas, the distortion of the polar vortex, the jet stream, even the distortion of the hydrological cycle that's causing all these weather disasters, changing seasons. So that's why I call this an existential crisis and a primary moral and spiritual issue of our time. But that power that's at the heart of the universe is here with us still, in and through all time and space, but also here with us at this particular time and at this particular place, here on planet Earth, the only home we have, and now the only time we have to act on behalf of life. In this time of changing paradigms, at this time when change must come, it's our time. And it's a tremendous challenge, it's a tremendous gift. And I'm reminded of the young woman who sent me a note after an action a long time ago when I lived in Santa Cruz. We'd done a nonviolent direct action, and she sent me a note, and it said, "I'm so grateful that we are alive at this time when the earth needs us most." And I'll close by saying that to you. I am so glad to be alive at this time. And I'm glad that you are alive. I'm glad that we are alive at this time when the earth needs us most.
Thank you very, very much, Sharon.
Of course.
A rich presentation, and we're open.